Hello Fringers! In this video I'm going to show you how to use my breakaway crochet techniques to work this Deco mat. The free written pattern for this project is available for download in my Ravelry pattern store, and in this video I will focus on specific concepts that might be hard to understand by reading the pattern alone. So let's have a closer look at what we will be making. For this project there are 5 rows of 5 motifs. And looking at a single motif, it is actually worked over 4 rounds. And by following a specific sequence and using my breakaway crochet techniques, we will be able to work every motif in this project one after the other without breaking the yarn between each one. So let's get started with the first motif, and I'll begin this demonstration with a special abbreviation that has to do with how we begin this and every other motif. And what I mean is, as I said, this motif is worked over 4 rounds. The first 3 rounds are the same for every motif, worked in the same way. And because of that, I think it's easier just to abbreviate those instructions into one little abbreviation which I call WFR, which stands for work first rounds. So whenever you see in the pattern WFRS, work first rounds, this is what you do. Start by putting a stitch marker onto the working loop on your hook. In this case, it's our slip knot because it's our first motif. Very important to do that. And next we do 8 yarn overs. And then we make a floating ring. To make a floating ring, do another yarn over and pinch the yarn close to the hook. Continue with another yarn over and draw in that new yarn with what you're already pinching. 2 pinch loops. Do another yarn over and pull through the 2 pinched loops. And these 2 loops here together are going to be the center of our motif. In other words, in the past you probably would have done chain 4 slip stitch to make a ring or a magic circle here. But in our case, we're doing this floating ring, which will hold all the stitches for round 1. To continue, we're going to make the first stitch of this first round a double crochet, and to do that we're going to use these first few loops that are already on the hook. So yarn around, pull through 2, yarn around, pull through 2, and that is essentially a floating double crochet, the first stitch of round 1. Now that that's done, we've got a lot of extra loops on the hook that we don't need until later rounds. So let's get rid of them for now. And that's why we have the stitch marker to hold our loop. Okay, then put the hook back into the working loop. And let's come back and do some stitches for round 1. What we need here are 11 more half double crochets into the floating ring. Just find those 2 loops. There's your floating ring, work our half double crochet in there, and continue on until we've worked all 11 half double crochets. There we go. That's all the stitches we need for round 1. And as you can see, our floating ring has kind of stretched out a little bit. That happens. So to tighten that up, go back to the slack yarn and kind of hang on to that first stitch and give a little tug. And that tightens up the center ring. That's going to look much better later on. Okay. Close this round with a slip stitch into the first stitch, and round 1 finished. Now for round 2, the first stitch is a double crochet, and we're going to use the slack yarn to do the yarn overs that are required to make that double crochet. So what we need to do is wrap around twice and then work off those loops as if it was a normal double crochet. There we go. And when we do it that way, that is actually called a load double crochet, the first stitch of round 2. Continue with another double crochet in the same stitch. And for the rest of the round, we work 2 double crochets in every stitch. Here we go. We should have 24 double crochets in that round. Finish the round with a slip stitch into the first stitch. Round 2 finished. Now, round 3 starts with a load treble. And again, we use our slack yarn to provide the yarn overs we need to make a treble stitch. So in this case, we need 3 yarn overs. And let's work off those loops. And there is our load treble. Now continue what we're going to do. We're going to work some double crochets into the first chain of this treble. So to find that, I'll go ahead and do a yarn over. Find this first thread that's sort of on the edge of the stitch, and then you go into the next one behind that. I hope you can see that. Going in there, and then just find the next one. Behind, and draw through the loop, and then work off that double crochet. So now that we've done the first one, the next ones are easier. You can see quite clearly where the next ones are going. So that's 1. We need a total of 4. So I'll do 3 more in that same place. And in the end, it's just going to look like we've done 5 double crochets, all kind of sprouting from the same location. Next, and kind of the pattern that's going to happen for the rest of this round, chain 6, skip 5, and in the 6th stitch, work a treble. And again, find that first chain of the treble and work 4 double crochets. Yeah, chain 6, skip 5, and that treble, next treble goes into the 6th stitch over. So I'll go ahead and finish that up. There should be 4 of these little fans or shells by the time we get to the end of this round. There we go, done the last chain 6, and to join this up to finish the round, what we need to do is to slip stitch in what would be the kind of the loops that would be above this stitch, which really aren't there at the moment. They are involving the slack yarn and this little loop here. So that's what we're going to use. So find this little loop here, and if you give it a tug, it will move the slack yarn, so you know that that's the right place to go into. And just go through there, go under the slack yarn, and do our final slip stitch of this round. I could tighten that up because I loosened that up a little bit. And there is round 3 finished. And now that we are at the end of round 3, that concludes the work first rounds process. So again, every motif will start this exact same way. Now to move on, we're going to use up the rest of our slack yarn. So let's take the stitch marker off. Get our hook back in there. Use the slack yarn to make 3 yarn overs. And then get the working loop back on the hook. And in the beginning that's going to spin around. That won't happen later on. Just hang on to it. Okay, so we've got 5 loops on the hook. And this is our process for making a restore double treble. Alright, so let's finish that off. Let's work those 5 loops off the hook by pulling through 2 loops at a time. So there we go. That's a double treble that stands as our first stitch of the 4th round. But since it's the first stitch of a round, I call that a load double treble, because we did a special way of making it. Now we've got another special stitch, which is called a back double row stitch, abbreviated BDR. And we are also going to use some of the loops that are on the previous stitch to make this new stitch. So to do this, start with a yarn over, and we're going to find the second group of these 2 loops here. So skip that first, pull over, and go to these 2 loops, which are the second pull over. That's where we go through with the hook and draw up a loop. Yarn over again. And let's try to find the back loop of the same stitch that we've just slipped into. And this first one can be a little bit stubborn, but there we go. Alright, go through and pull up a loop. So again, we've got 5 loops on the hook, and work them off. So what this does is it gives us the illusion that we've actually worked 2 rows of double crochet, but actually we've only worked 1. Alright, so that's just something I do that makes this motif have its unusual look. Alright, so continue by putting 2 back double row stitches in each of the next 4 stitches. I'll go through that again. Yarn over, find the second pull through of the previous stitch, draw up a loop, yarn over. Now we're going into the next stitch with our first of 2 stitches, go through the back loop, work off those loops, and let's put another one in that same place. There we go, and as we go along it becomes very obvious where to put the hook into for that first time you go into the stitch. Okay, so I'll continue making the next, we've got 6 more to go. There we go. So that's going to look like we've done 10 double crochets along this row and 5 increases along this so-called row, or I probably should be calling it a round. Okay. Continue with chain 6, and we're basically going to do the same thing over this little shell. This time it starts with just a normal double treble going through both loops of that first stitch, and then we go on with the back loop double row stitches. This first one goes in that first stitch where we've just gone into before, and so on. And again, we'll end up with what will look like 10 double crochets across the top here. Yeah, that's that second, I don't know what to call it, a wedge or a shell, a giant shell finished. And we have come now to the breakaway point on this motif. So what happens now is we pause work on this motif, and we're going to start work on the motif that will go next door here. And again, that's where the work first rounds come into play. So from now on, you just repeat what we did in the very beginning. Start with a stitch marker in the working loop, 8 yarn overs, make the floating ring, make a double crochet by pulling through 2 loops twice, release all the extra loops and yarn over off the hook, and get the working loop back on. Continue round 1 of this motif with 11 half double crochets into the floating ring. If your floating ring is too big, give a pull on the slack yarn that connects the 2 motifs. You tighten that center ring up and slip stitch. Round 2 starts with a load double crochet, and now that we have connected this motif to the next one, in this case from now on it's easier to remove the hook, wrap the yarn overs by going under and over like this, take just the yarn we need to make this double crochet, or I should say load double crochet. There you go. Then continue with the 2 double crochets in each stitch all the way around. Close with a slip stitch. Start round 3 with a load treble. Again, take the hook off the working loop, come to the slack yarn, come underneath. We need 3 yarn overs. 1, 2, 3, and then get the hook back into the working loop. And let's tighten everything up. Again, we don't want to use more yarn than we need. Do our pull throughs to complete the load treble. Continue with 4 double crochets into that first chain of the treble. Chain 6, skip 5 and work a treble into the 6th stitch, and repeat that around for the rest of this round with the 4 double crochets, chain 6. And remember, when we close this round, we go into that special loop. It's underneath that first, or just above the first stitch. Go through there, underneath the slack yarn, work a slip stitch, tighten that up if it got stretched, and there's our work first rounds of the second motif done. To continue with round 4, it's actually going to be exactly like we've done here. So remove the hook, remove the stitch marker, and coming this way we put that marked stitch back on the hook, do 3 yarn overs, put the working loop back on. That sets up our restore double treble, work off those loops, and then continue with the back loop double row stitches in this little shell, chain stitch, or chain 6, and then in this shell. There we go, I've just finished up that second little wedge or shell, whatever you want to call it, fan. And again, we are now ready to break away to the next motif that will sit just to the right of this one. So what I'll do is I'll work one more exactly like I've done the first 2. And that's as far as I'm going to go on this sample, just to work 3 across. That's enough to describe what you should be doing. So I'll meet you when I finish that 3rd motif. And that's, again, as far as I'm going to go on this sample, these 3 motifs in a row. And this completes our foundation row. So the next step is to do the return row. And that's where we just keep working around the current motif, and we're going to finish off these 2 motifs and work a little bit more on this one. So really all we have to do is carry on with the 6 more chains and work our 10 double row stitches in each of these 2 little wedges, and then something special happens here. So what I'll do, I'll work up to this point here and these 6 chains, and I'll show you what happens then. So there we are. I've gone all the way around during the final chain 6, and this brings us to the point where it's time to close this motif off, and we do that by doing a slip stitch between this and this motif. So if you look just between there, there's a little crevice. That's where we do a slip stitch. So let's go ahead and do that. And that completes that last motif on the end there. And now you just continue on the next motif, starting with chain 6. But before you go on to work the next little shell thing, there's another little job. We've got a connection here. Let me lay this out a little bit better. What we need to do is connect this to this. We've got a little space there. So every motif connects twice to the one next door. Now the instructions say to count back 12 chains behind the hook. And what I mean is, we look at what we've just done and go backwards. There are these 12 chains here until we get back to that last double row stitch, and that's where we slip stitch into. There, that's made the second join that we need. And now we just continue along with our middle motif. Again, starting with our double treble in the next treble stitch. And so on. Just work your way around, slip stitch in between. And then when you get back to the first motif, everything is the same, except you're going to stop here after you've done the 10 double row stitches. That's where you stop. That's the breakaway point. So there's our return row finished. These two motifs have been worked all the way around, and you can see here when I got back to the one at the beginning of the row, I've only worked that first wedge because now it's time to jump up to the next row. So the next row, things will start out again with the working the first rounds of that first motif, and then you work the first wedge, and then you carry on to the next. So a lot is going to be the same. What will be different is that as we work these two motifs, we've got to join them in as we work along. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll start this first motif here and work that first wedge, which gets us to the breakaway point, to move on to this motif here and show you how this join happens in these two places. And here we are. There is the first motif of the row, again only working a quarter of the way around. I started the second motif. I've worked that first wedgy thing or fan, and now it's time to make a connection between this one and this one. Now the instructions say to count back, again you've got to make it sound like official language. I said to count back 39 stitches behind the hook. So if we spread it out and count back behind the hook, there will be 39 stitches, and you slip stitch into the 40th one. Another way to think about it is to skip back 4 of these little fans, or really you can eyeball it, and you just know that that space there is going to look kind of like a rounded off diamond, I suppose. But in any case, that is where our join happens. So let's go ahead and do that. And it's just in that, what would have been the first stitch of that fan there. Okay, now we've got one more join. That was the first one, and we've got to do our 6 chains and do our next join, and that's just very much like we did on the return row. So do our chains 6, count back 12. There is our joining point, and then we're ready to go on to the next wedgy fanny thing on this motif. So you just go up and finish that one off. Once this is finished, then again you come across and do the next motif. This last one and any other that would have been on the row are all worked just like we do this one here. So there, we've come to the end of this joined foundation row, and the next step again is to do a return row, going back the other way, finishing off these 2 motifs and any others that would have been in the row, and working a little bit more on the first one. And if there was another row, we would just repeat this joined foundation row and return row again. But for now, I think I've covered all the important points that you might not have understood by reading the pattern alone, as I say. So I will leave you to it, but the only other thing is, you're going to finish off the left edge pretty much like you've done the return row. There won't be any new concepts there, it's just that you'll be going in a different direction. If I've gone a little bit too fast, let me know. I've just tried to cover anything that might have been unusual, but the pattern sets out the full instructions. And I should also say it's very important to block this piece, otherwise it kind of looks like a pile of potato chips until you, steam it or block it, just to get it all looking nice and flat. So I hope you enjoy this interesting motif in this project. Please write in, and like I say, if there's something you need more information on or more detail on how to do something. I would really love to see anything that you end up making. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.